In 1957, two climbers stood 46 meters from the summit of a Himalayan peak no one had ever reached. They could see the top, one more pitch of steep ice, maybe an hour of climbing. And they turned around, voluntarily. That mountain has never been climbed since. But here's the thing, Machhapuchare isn't some hidden peak buried in a remote valley. Thousands of trekkers photograph it every year from popular trails. It's one of the most visible mountains in Nepal, its distinctive fishtail silhouette dominating the skyline above Pokhara. These aren't mountains humans can't visit. These are mountains humans have chosen not to touch. And the reasons why are stranger than the peaks themselves. If you want to see more videos exploring Earth's most extreme places, subscribe now. 46 meters from forever. The year was 1957. Wilfrid Noyce had already stood on the summit of Everest 4 years earlier, as part of the historic 1953 British expedition. He knew what it took to reach the top of the world's highest peak. He understood the calculation of risk versus reward, the pull of the summit, the voice in every climber's head that says, just a little farther. On May 17th, Noyce and his climbing partner A.D.M. Cox pushed to 6,947 meters on Machhapuchare's northwest ridge. The summit rose above them, close enough to study every detail of the final pitch, close enough that a strong climber could reach it in under an hour. They didn't go. King Mahendra of Nepal had granted their expedition permission with an explicit instruction, do not step on top. The mountain was sacred to local communities, believed to be the home of the god Shiva. The king's condition wasn't a suggestion, it was the price of access. Noyce later wrote Climbing the Fish's Tail, documenting how he deliberately stopped 150 feet short of the summit, the only climbing record ever published for this mountain. When his expedition returned to Kathmandu, Nepal closed Machhapuchare to climbing permanently. That was nearly 70 years ago. Since then, no climber has gone higher. The summit remains exactly as Noyce saw it in 1957, untouched, unreached, protected by nothing more than an agreement between a king and a mountaineer who chose to honor it. Every year, tens of thousands of trekkers hike to Annapurna Base Camp. They wake before dawn to watch sunrise paint Machhapuchare, gold and pink. They photograph its twin peaks, that distinctive fishtail silhouette rising nearly 7,000 meters above sea level, and every one of them is looking at a summit that exists within sight of popular trails, yet hasn't felt a human footstep since two men decided not to take those final 46 meters. But Machhapuchare isn't even the highest mountain that's never been climbed. That title belongs to a peak so remote, so difficult, and so protected that no human may ever stand on its summit. Not because they can't, but because an entire nation decided they shouldn't. The White Peak of Three Brothers. Gangkhar Puensum rises on the border between Bhutan and Tibet. At 7,570 meters, it's the highest unclimbed mountain on Earth, and it will likely stay that way forever. To understand what that height means, consider this. The summit sits at roughly the cruising altitude of a commercial aircraft. At this elevation, atmospheric pressure drops below 40% of what you'd experience at sea level. Your blood struggles to carry oxygen. Your brain begins to swell. Human physiology doesn't just slow down at this altitude, it starts shutting down. The mountain's prominence is equally staggering. It rises 2,995 meters above everything around it, nearly 3 vertical kilometers of rock, ice, and thin air dominating the landscape. If you could somehow stand at its base and look straight up, you'd be staring at a wall of mountain taller than the depth of the Grand Canyon. Between 1983 and 1986, 4 expeditions attempted the summit. All failed. British climbers retreated with severe frostbite, their fingers and toes blackened by cold that penetrates the best gear money can buy. Austrian teams faced monsoon conditions so brutal that forward progress became impossible. A Japanese expedition in 1998 pushed higher than anyone before, reaching 6,880 meters past a feature they called Dinosaur Ridge, before pulmonary edema forced an emergency evacuation. One climber was injured falling from a rock section. The mountain seemed to reject every approach. Then, Bhutan made a decision that changed everything. In 1994, the kingdom banned all climbing above 6,000 meters out of respect for local spiritual beliefs. In 2003, they expanded this into a complete prohibition on mountaineering anywhere in the country. The mountain's name tells you why. In Dzongkha, Gangkhar Puensum translates to White Peak of the Three Spiritual Brothers. a reference to its role in local cosmology as a sacred dwelling place. The government's position was explicit. Some places are not meant to be conquered. Some summits should remain untouched. Now, unlike peaks where climbers eventually succeed through better equipment, more refined techniques, or favorable weather windows, Gangkhar Puensum exists outside that equation entirely. The technical challenges are immense. Yes, the altitude is brutal, but the real barrier isn't physical, it's categorical. Bhutan decided that this mountain belongs to something larger than human ambition. And it's not alone. There's another mountain that stands forbidden, not by one nation's laws, but by the consensus of 4 of the world's oldest religions. A peak so universally sacred that even the greatest mountaineer in history was offered permission to climb it and said no. The mountain that stopped Reinhold Messner. Mount Kailash rises 6,638 meters above the Tibetan Plateau in far western China. It's not especially tall by Himalayan standards. Dozens of nearby peaks exceed its height. The technical difficulties are moderate. Experienced mountaineers have called the route straightforward. None of that matters. Kailash is sacred in 4 religions simultaneously. In Hinduism, it's the legendary home of Lord Shiva, where the god sits in eternal meditation. In Buddhism, it represents Mount Meru, the cosmic axis around which the entire universe revolves, the spiritual center of existence itself. For Jains, it marks the place where their first Tirthankara attained liberation from the cycle of rebirth. And in the ancient Bon tradition of Tibet, it serves as the seat of spiritual power, a mountain that anchors the world. Every year, thousands of pilgrims travel to Kailash to complete the Kora, a 52-kilometer circumambulation of the mountain's base. Some walk it in a single exhausting push. Others prostrate themselves along the entire route, laying flat on the ground, rising, stepping forward to where their hands reached, and laying flat again, measuring the sacred path with their own bodies inch by inch for miles. But no one climbs. In the 1980s, the Chinese government offered a climbing permit to Reinhold Messner. This is a man who had already climbed all 14 8,000-meter peaks, the only 14 mountains on Earth that rise above that threshold. He'd summited Everest without supplemental oxygen. He'd crossed Antarctica on foot. His resume of extreme achievement has no equal in mountaineering history. Messner declined. He later explained that climbing Kailash would violate something more important than any mountaineering record. The mountain's significance wasn't about altitude or technical challenge. It was about meaning. And meaning doesn't yield to ice axes and crampons. The power of Kailash isn't physical. It's categorical. It exists in a domain where the question, can it be climbed, simply doesn't apply. Certain places stand outside the realm of conquest, protected not by walls or guards, but by shared human understanding. But not every barrier to a summit is spiritual. Some mountains remain unreachable for a far darker reason, because the humans who control access to them are too busy fighting each other to let anyone through. The highest battlefield on Earth. The Siachen Glacier stretches through the eastern Karakoram, a frozen river of ice more than 70 kilometers long. It's one of the largest glaciers outside the polar regions, and since 1984, it's been a war zone. India and Pakistan both claim this territory. Both nations maintain military outposts above 7,000 meters. Soldiers live year-round in conditions that would challenge the most experienced mountaineers. Not for weeks during an expedition, but continuously, for months-long deployments in thin air and brutal cold. Rising above this frozen battlefield are some of the most spectacular unclimbed peaks on Earth. Apsarasas Kangri, 2 tops out at 7,241 meters. Apsarasas Kangri III reaches 7,236 meters. They're giants by any measure, higher than any summit in the Americas or Europe. No one has climbed them. Not because the routes are impossible, but because expeditions aren't permitted. The glacier has killed more soldiers through the environment itself than through combat. High-altitude cerebral edema causes the brain to swell until consciousness fades. Hidden crevasses swallow men whole, 20, 30, 50 meters of ice-walled tombs. Hypothermia progresses through stages of confusion and exhaustion until the body simply stops. Frostbite blackens extremities until gangrene demands amputation just to save a life. These mountains exist in a limbo where geopolitics determines access, not geology. The summits are there. The routes could be studied, but the peaks themselves have become casualties of a conflict that has nothing to do with them. trapped behind lines drawn by governments, inaccessible not because of technical difficulty, but because humans turned the glacier into a battlefield. It would be easy to conclude that these patterns are permanent, that mountains protected by law, faith, or conflict will remain forever beyond reach. But in 2024, one mountain that had defeated every attempt for over 4 decades finally gave in. The mountain that finally broke. Machhapuchare rises 7,453 meters above the Bhutan Glacier in Pakistan's Karakoram Range. For 41 years, it resisted every expedition that tried to reach its summit. The approach alone would stop most climbers. The Bhutan Glacier stretches 56 kilometers, the 7th longest non-polar glacier on Earth, and the route to Machhapuchare threads through a maze of crevasses and unstable seracs. These are house-sized blocks of ice that collapse without warning, bearing whatever lies beneath them. Timing your passage becomes a gamble against physics. In 1999, a Spanish team reached 6,650 meters before the mountain forced them back. In 2020, Czech climbers failed when excessive snow buried the ridge in deadly instability. They returned in 2021 and failed again. Then came 2024. On July 5th, 3 Czech mountaineers, Zdeněk Hák, Radoslav Groh, and Jaroslav Bansky, stood on the summit of Machhapuchare after a 6-day alpine push that demanded everything they had. Day 1. 1,400 meters of altitude gained to a first bivouac at 5,350 meters. Days 2 and 3, what they described as endless ice climbing. To establish camp at 6,300 meters. Day 4, a final bivouac carved into the slope at 7,250 meters. Day 5, an alpine start in darkness, moving upward through the pre-dawn cold until they reached the top around noon. The summit was only half the challenge. Their account of the descent reads like a controlled nightmare. There are avalanches falling all around, and even the glacier route doesn't look safe. Nevertheless, we decide to descend further. The mountain that had remained unclimbed for 41 years finally yielded, to patience, to modern equipment, to favorable weather, and to 3 climbers willing to push into conditions that would have stopped anyone with more sense than ambition. What we choose to leave untouched. These stories force a question that modern exploration rarely asks. Should we climb every peak we can? The answer used to be obvious. For centuries, mountaineering was driven by the irresistible pull of the unknown. Every summit represented a challenge to be conquered, a record to be set, a flag to be planted. The mountain existed, therefore someone should stand on top of it. But the peaks we've explored here suggest a different framework. Machhapuchare remains untouched because one climber, 46 meters from glory, chose to honor an agreement. Gangkhar Puensum stands protected because an entire nation decided that leaving it alone was more valuable than any expedition. Mount Kailash holds pilgrims in orbit around its base while the summit remains inviolate, not by force, but by shared understanding across 4 religions and thousands of years. Even the Siachen peaks, inaccessible for the worst of reasons, raise the question of what we lose when human conflict closes off the natural world. And Machhapuchare, its fall in 2024 proves that patience and persistence can still break through, but also reminds us that some mountains yield only after decades of refusal. As satellite imagery maps the remotest corners of Earth with unprecedented precision, and climate change reshapes the glaciers that make routes possible or impossible, the boundary between unconquered and protected keeps shifting. Some mountains will be climbed eventually. Better gear, more accurate weather forecasting, new generations of climbers pushing harder. These forces erode resistance over time. But Gangkhar Puensum will likely remain untouched forever. Not because the ice can't be climbed or the altitude can't be survived, because Bhutan looked at its highest peak and decided that choosing not to conquer it was its own kind of achievement. Some mountains aren't climbed, some mountains are chosen, and maybe that says more about us than any summit ever could.